Imagine a country where women are fundamentally outperforming men,
Right.
like out-educating them, outliving them by nearly 12 years, and just generally dominating the core human development metrics.
Yeah, it's a completely counterintuitive reality.
Exactly, because if you're just looking at those data points, you would assume, that this country is some sort of progressive, unstoppable economic superpower.
Oh, absolutely. By all traditional metrics, a society with that kind of highly educated, long-living female majority, they should be dominating the global stage.
Right. But instead, over the last 3 decades, this nation's global ranking in human development has actually plummeted. I mean, we're talking dropping more than 60 spots.
Yeah.
And its male population is facing this catastrophic mortality crisis, while the female population, the ones driving all this development, is just systematically boxed out of political power.
It is arguably one of the most baffling demographic and economic paradoxes of the modern era.
So, welcome to another custom tailored deep dive. I'm so glad you could join us today because we are unpacking a really fascinating data stack.
Yeah, really glad to be diving into this one. It's a heavy one, but incredibly important.
It really is.
Yeah.
So, the report we have today is titled Russia and the Global Human Development Report: Equality Beyond Gender and the Ecological Cost.
And if you're hearing those initial numbers, you're probably trying to square this circle in your head right now.
Right. You're thinking, how can a country be more equal on paper, but feel more restrictive in reality?
Exactly.
So our mission today is to dig into decades of data. We're tracking the numbers from 1990 all the way to 2023 to figure out exactly how these shifting gender dynamics, these health crises, and massive environmental debts are all kind of colliding in Russia.
And just to be clear right off the top, our goal here is strictly to let the math tell the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're looking at the sociological and economic data completely impartially. We're not endorsing any political viewpoints here. We just want to understand the mechanisms, the why and the how behind these deeply counterintuitive truths.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to do that, we really need to set a baseline for how we measure human flourishing, right?
Right. So if you follow global development at all, you already know that the Human Development Index, or the HDI, isn't just about how much money a country makes.
GDP alone it's a blunt instrument.
Exactly. It doesn't tell you how people are actually living. The HDI triangulates a society's health by looking at three main things. First, life expectancy, so a long and healthy life.
Right.
Second, access to knowledge, which is measured through years of schooling. And third, a decent standard of living, which is measured by gross national income per capita.
So it's more of a holistic pulse check.
Yeah, exactly. And the data stack we have uses this specific metric to paint a really contradictory, almost schizophrenic picture of Russian society over the last 30 years.
So let's start with the trajectory itself, because the first major tension in our sources is this disconnect between absolute growth and relative decline.
We're at the absolute versus relative standing.
Yeah, because if you look at Russia's HDI in 1990, the score was 0.762.
Okay.
And then you fast forward to 2023, and that number has risen to 0.832.
Which, I mean, human development is measured on a scale from 0 to 1.
Right.
So 0.832 is objectively really solid.
Yeah, they are comfortably in the UN's high human development category.
They are entirely above the global average, which right now sits at 0.756.
Wow. Okay.
So if we break that down into lived reality for you, it means their expected years of schooling is just over 13 years. 13.185, actually,
Okay.
compared to a global average of 13.
So they're slightly ahead there.
Right. But then look at their gross national income per capita. It's over $39,000. $39,222 specifically.
And the global average is what?
Roughly $20,000.
Wait, really? 20,327, I think the source says.
Yeah, so it absolutely dwarfs the global average.
So, okay, if you live there, on paper, you have more money, you have more education, and you have a better HDI score than your parents did in the 1990s.
You are materially better off, unquestionably.
But then we look at the global rankings. And this is where it gets weird.
Yeah, it's a steep drop.
In 1990, that score of 0.762 that ranked Russia second globally in human development.
Second in the entire world.
But by 2023, despite actually growing their absolute score to 0.832, Their ranking has violently slid down to roughly 64th or 65th place.
Yeah.
How do you drop over 60 ranks while objectively improving your own score?
Because human development doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
It's the concept of relative standing in global economics.
Sure.
It's like, well, while Russia was steadily climbing the stairs of human development over the last 30 years, large swaths of the rest of the globe were just taking the elevator.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, think of the explosive growth in East Asia, for example.
Yeah.
They saw exponential, aggressive improvements in health, education, and income.
Right. It's like getting a 3% raise at your job every single year. Right. You feel good about it.
Yeah.
But then you realize all your colleagues are getting 10% raises. So your bank account is technically bigger, but your purchasing power relative to everyone else in the room has actually shrunk.
That's a perfect analogy. Your absolute growth just isn't keeping pace with the rest of the world.
I'm trying to imagine the psychological impact of that on a national level for the people living there.
It's got to be intense.
I mean, if you are a citizen, you look around your immediate life and you feel economically secure based on your own family's history. You remember the extreme struggles of the post-Soviet 1990s. You look at your life today and you say, well, things are materially better. We have grown.
But the moment you interact with the rapidly accelerating global economy, you face this immense systemic friction.
Yeah, because you went from holding the silver medal to not even breaking the top 50.
Exactly. It creates a profound cognitive dissonance. The internal experience of absolute growth is constantly clashing with the external reality of relative decline.
Right.
It breeds this specific kind of societal nostalgia mixed with frustration. The data suggests a sluggishness in their rate of improvement, like a heavy structural anchor that prevents them from keeping pace with the rest of the developed world.
Okay, so why is their absolute growth not keeping pace? To answer that, we have to look inside the engine, right?
We do.
And what the sources show is that inside this engine, one specific demographic is doing almost all the heavy lifting.
Which brings us to the Gender Development Index, the GDI.
Right, because this flips every standard development narrative on its head.
It really does. So the GDI takes the core HDI metrics, health, education, income, and separates them by gender to create a ratio.
Okay.
A GDI of exactly 1.0 would mean perfect developmental equality between men and women.
And the global average is roughly 0.955.
Exactly, meaning globally, women still lag slightly behind men in comprehensive human development.
That's the standard global reality that we're all used to seeing.
Right. But in Russia, the 2023 GDI is 1.023.
They literally broke the scale.
They completely inverted it. A number over 1.0 means women have actually surpassed men in human development.
Wow.
And what's fascinating here is that the historical data shows this isn't a recent blip. From 2003 to 2005, Russia's GDI actually ranked #1 in the world.
Seriously?
Yeah, it hit 1.053.
That is wild. Let's unpack the mechanics of how this happens, because the sources point to this thing they call the education miracle.
Yeah, the numbers here are just staggering.
They really are. Globally, if we look at the population over 25 years old with at least some secondary education, there is a clear gap favoring men.
Right.
It's like 70.2% of men have it versus 62.0% of women.
But in Russia, 99.1% of men have secondary education.
Almost universal.
Almost universal, right.
Oh,
But for Russian women, it is 99.3%.
wow.
They've essentially achieved absolute universal secondary education, and the women are actively edging out the men.
And it's not just basic schooling either, right? If we look at the mean years of schooling, the actual average time spent inside a classroom, Russian women average 12.41 years,
Yeah.
which consistently outpaces the male average of 12.32 years.
You really have to visualize what this means for the fabric of the society.
Yeah, paint that picture for us.
Well, in most of the world, male education rates are the gold standard that policymakers are desperately trying to get female populations to reach.
Right.
But in Russia, the infrastructure of higher learning, the universities, the technical institutes, it's fundamentally dominated by female attendance and graduation.
Okay.
You are churning out a highly literate, highly capable female workforce that leads the world in educational equity. Women are an underappreciated, massive demographic engine there.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, and I want to challenge you, the listener, with this thought.
Okay.
If you have a society where women are practically 100% educated and outscoring men in development,
Yeah.
Why isn't this translating to an unstoppable economic superpower?
Because education is only one-third of the HDI equation.
Right.
The second part is health and longevity, and
Yeah.
this is where the Russian data takes a very dark, tragic turn.
The demographic tragedy, the male mortality chasm.
Yeah.
I have to admit, when I was reviewing the life expectancy data from the source stack, I actually had to double check the figures to make sure it wasn't a typo.
I don't blame you. It's jarring.
In 2023, the life expectancy for a Russian woman is 79.0 years. But for a Russian man, it is 67.3 years.
That is an extreme lifespan gap, 11.7 years to be exact.
To contextualize that for you listening, the global average gap is only 4.9 years.
Right, like 75.9 for women versus 71.0 for men.
Exactly. Biologically, women tend to live slightly longer globally. A 5-year gap is standard human biology.
But an almost 12-year gap, that is a systemic societal trauma.
It's insane.
It acts as a massive anchor dragging down the nation's overall HDI. Because an 11.7-year difference is not a statistical anomaly. It is a severe public health crisis.
We really need to unpack the why here. How does a developed nation lose its men at 67?
Well, sociologists and public health experts attribute this to a confluence of deeply entrenched factors. You really have to look back at the historical context of the post-Soviet collapse in the 1990s.
Okay, the transition to capitalism.
Exactly. That transition, heavily dislocated, male-dominated heavy industries, and this led to a profound psychological and economic shock for men who, lost their traditional roles as primary breadwinners overnight.
So it was an identity crisis as much as an economic one.
Right. And this shock manifested in severe lifestyle factors. We're talking historically unprecedented levels of alcoholism, cardiovascular disease, and external causes of death.
Like accidents.
Accidents, occupational hazards in resource extraction industries, things like that. It created a cycle of premature male mortality that the healthcare system is actually still struggling to correct today.
I want to focus on the societal mechanics of that for a moment. Think about what a town looks like, what a city looks like when half the male population is just gone by their late 60s.
Yeah, what happens to the family structures?
You are essentially engineering a society of widows. It's like having a world-class, highly educated rowing team. The women, but half the boat, the men, drops their oars way before the finish line. The boat is going to drag.
That is a grim but highly accurate analogy. You're fundamentally altering the family structure. The emotional and financial burden on surviving women is immense.
Grandfathers are missing.
Exactly. A traditional source of familial childcare and support is largely absent.
Right.
And from a macroeconomic perspective, the country is losing a massive chunk of its most experienced workforce right at the peak of their earning and mentoring potential.
Wow. Yeah.
They aren't retiring and transitioning into a silver economy. They are simply gone. This places immense strain on the medical system in their final years without contributing to the long-term pension cycle.
Okay, let me synthesize this because this is where my internal monologue was just screaming when reading the report.
Let's hear it.
We have established that the women in the society are significantly better educated than the global average.
Right.
They're slightly better educated than the men in their own country.
Yes.
And they are outliving the men by nearly 12 years.
So true.
Logically, if you possess more educational credentials and you live a decade longer, you dictate the terms of the economy.
Right.
You hold the corner offices, you sit in the parliament. If women are living longer and are more educated, they must be running the country and making all the money.
Well, that assumes human capital automatically translates into structural power. And the economic and political data proves that assumption entirely false.
The glass ceiling.
A very thick glass ceiling.
Yeah, let's look at the income and influence data, because despite everything we just said, the overall gross national income per capita is robust, sitting around $39,000. But when you split that by gender, the disparity is violent.
It's the income scissors effect.
Yeah. The 2023 male GNI per capita is $47,866.
Right.
The female GNI is only $31,720.
That is a gap of over $16,000 a year.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for you listening. We have a society where women are out-educating men and outliving them by a mile, yet they earn $16,000 less a year.
Yeah.
How does a highly educated female majority get boxed out of the boardroom?
It comes down to severe sector segregation in the labor market. Even in a society with absolute educational parity, or in this case, slight female superiority, structural workplace biases, and industry selection, remain firmly entrenched.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. So in Russia, the state-funded sectors that are vital to society but historically low-paying, such as education, administration, basic healthcare, these are overwhelmingly feminized.
So the women are the teachers and the nurses.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the high-paying sectors, resource extraction, oil, gas, heavy industry, corporate finance, these remain heavily male-dominated.
I see.
Women are entering the workforce highly qualified. In fact, their labor force participation is 56.2%.
Which is higher than the global female average, right?
Yes, the global average is 46.5%, so they are economically active. But they are hitting promotion ceilings. They aren't advancing to senior executive roles, and they're clustered in industries where the salary floor is fundamentally lower.
So they're working, they're educated, but the industries they are pushed into just don't pay as well.
Exactly. And you see this exact same dynamic replicated flawlessly in the political sphere.
The parliament numbers.
Yeah. In 2023, despite being the educated majority, only 17.8% of parliamentary seats are held by women.
Barely 1 in 5 decision makers is a woman.
Right. And the global average is 26.5%.
So a nation leading the world in female education is significantly lagging behind the global average in female political representation.
It highlights a system that is perfectly designed to support women's development up to a very specific threshold.
Up to the point of structural power.
Exactly. And the source contrasts this with the Gender Inequality Index data, specifically on maternal health, which perfectly illustrates this irony.
Oh, right, the GDI data.
Yeah. If you look at reproductive health care, Russia performs exceptionally well. Their maternal mortality ratio plummeted from 89.7 deaths per 100,000 births in 1995 down to just 13.7 in 2023.
That's a massive drop.
It is. And the global average is 216.1.
Wow.
Also, their adolescent birth rate is incredibly low at 13.0 compared to the global 39.1.
So what does that tell us about the society's values?
It tells us that the society highly values women as mothers. It provides excellent reproductive health care to ensure women survive childbirth and can maintain the family structure.
Especially given the male mortality crisis, they need that stability.
Right. They ensure women are highly educated so they can serve as the backbone of the civic workforce. But the moment they try to translate that health and education into executive power or political leadership, the doors lock.
They value them as mothers and administrators, but limit their role as decision makers and high earners.
Precisely. It's a profound failure to optimize human capital.
Okay, I want to pivot here because despite this glaring gender income gap, when you look at the overall inequality of the nation, the data throws us another curveball.
The IHDI.
Yes, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index. I was genuinely confused when I first read this section.
Why is that?
Well, we just established a massive $16,000 gender pay gap. We have a literal missing generation of older men due to an 11-year mortality gap.
Right.
We have massive political inequality in parliament.
Yeah, it sounds like a profoundly unequal society.
Exactly, but then the IHDI claims the exact opposite. It says Russia actually has a fairness advantage.
Right. This raises an important question about how we define a fair society.
Okay, explain the IHDI for us because it feels completely backwards based on what we just talked about.
Sure. So the standard HDI is just an average.
Right.
And averages are notorious for hiding extreme inequality.
Right.
If you have a room of 10 people and one person has $10 million while the other 9 have nothing, the average wealth is $1 million.
The room looks rich on paper.
Exactly. But the lived reality for 90% of the room is poverty. The IHDI measures the loss of human development potential due to unfairness in how health, education, and income are actually distributed.
So it measures the penalty a country takes for hoarding resources at the top.
Yes. And globally, the average loss to HDI due to inequality is a massive 22.0%.
So the world loses over a fifth of its developmental potential just to unfair distribution.
Right. So given the income gap and the mortality gap in Russia, you'd expect their inequality penalty to be huge.
Yeah, I would.
But looking at the 2023 figures, Russia's HDI loss due to inequality is only 8.9%.
Only 8.9. How can a metric claim a society with an almost 12-year life expectancy gap and a $16,000 pay gap only loses 8.9% to inequality?
Because you have to separate outcomes from baseline access.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
The IHDI data breaks down where this 8.9% loss comes from, and it reveals a remarkable level of equitable resource distribution across the population.
Yeah.
For instance, the loss due to the internal distribution of education is a microscopic 1.5%.
Meaning almost everyone, regardless of whether they live in a city or a rural area, gets roughly the exact same amount of basic schooling.
Precisely. The baseline floor for human development is quite high.
Right.
The loss in life expectancy distribution across the general population is only 5.7%, meaning basic access to a local clinic or a hospital is remarkably equitable across the vast geography of the country.
Even with the men dying younger.
Right, because the access to care is relatively distributed, even if the outcomes differ based on lifestyle and occupation.
I see.
And even the income inequality penalty is only 1.7%, which is still incredibly low globally.
Okay, so we aren't talking about fairness of ultimate outcomes, like who gets to be an executive or a politician. We are talking about the floor.
The foundation, exactly.
The baseline ability to learn to read, the ability to see a doctor for a broken arm, the ability to have a heated home that is deeply ingrained and shared.
It's a high shared baseline. High-level wealth and political power might be hoarded by a few, but the foundational requirements for a decent life are accessible to the vast majority.
Let's think about the psychological effect of that on the average person. We talked earlier about the cognitive dissonance of falling in the global rankings. But internally, this legacy of equitable resource distribution has to act as a massive social stabilizer.
Oh, absolutely.
If almost everyone gets the same baseline education and uses the same basic medical facilities, society feels somewhat fair on a day-to-day basis.
Even if high-level wealth is concentrated.
Exactly. The basic social contract is largely being met for the average citizen.
It creates a robust resilience in their HDI score. The foundation is solid. But that brings us to the next massive issue.
What is fueling this egalitarian baseline?
Exactly.
Because to maintain universal education, massive civic infrastructure, and a high gross national income across such a huge country, it requires an unbelievable amount of power.
A massive economic engine.
And as the sources reveal in the final section, all this development, the schools, the hospitals, the wealth, it all has a planetary price tag.
Which brings us to the PHDI.
Yes, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
This is a vital metric. It takes a country's standard HDI and essentially discounts it based on the environmental damage required to achieve it.
So it factors in things like carbon footprint.
Yes, carbon dioxide emissions per capita and the material footprint per capita. It asks the question, are you achieving high human development sustainably, or are you just borrowing from the planet?
And when environmental impact is factored in, Russia's HDI falls off a cliff.
It's a devastating drop.
We established their standard HDI as a very strong 0.832.
Right.
When you adjust for planetary pressures, that score drops to 0.710.
That erases almost 3 decades of developmental progress.
It's massive, and the carbon footprint data explains exactly why. In 2023, Russia produced 12.57 tons of CO2 emissions per capita.
12.57.
Yeah. And just for context, the global average is 4.4 tons.
So they are nearly 3 times the global average.
It's staggering. Now, what's interesting is their material footprint, the actual raw materials extracted, is roughly on par with the global average.
Really?
Yeah, it's 11.69 tons versus the global 12.71.
So they aren't consuming an unusual amount of physical stuff.
Right, which proves the issue is specifically their energy-intensive carbon-heavy infrastructure.
I mean, it makes sense. It's a massive cold country. You need a lot of energy just to keep the lights on and the house is heated.
Exactly. And their entire mechanism for generating that high gross national income is fundamentally reliant on the extraction and processing of fossil fuels.
Right. So what does this all mean?
It's like looking at someone's lifestyle and being incredibly impressed by their house and their car until you see their credit card statement.
That's a great way to think about it.
Russia is living an HDI lifestyle of 0.832, but their planetary credit score brings them down to a 0.710.
They are subsidizing their high human development through immense ecological extraction. They are developing on borrowed time.
Let's extrapolate what this means for the future. The world is trying to transition to green energy, right?
Slowly but surely, yeah.
So how does a country completely reliant on a carbon-heavy engine maintain its human development if the global market shifts?
It's a huge existential question. If your primary mechanism for generating wealth becomes obsolete or heavily penalized, how do you fund that equitable baseline we just talked about?
Right. How do you keep the schools running? How do you fund the hospitals?
If they can't transition, their actual standard of living will inevitably crash down to meet that 0.710 reality.
We have covered so much ground today. Let's pull all of this together and build the ultimate radar chart for you listening.
Okay.
When you look at Russia through the lens of all these intersecting metrics, it is a nation of stark contrasts.
Utter extreme.
On one side, they are leading the globe in female education and reproductive health. They hold a solid, equitable baseline for the general population.
Right.
But simultaneously, they are suffering a devastating male health crisis, severe political glass ceilings for women, and relying on an unsustainable, carbon-heavy growth model.
It really is a paradox. They have this incredible human capital, especially their women, but it's restricted and fueled by an ecological deficit.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to ponder.
Yeah, think about this. If a nation can simultaneously have its women outperforming its men, suffer a severe male mortality crisis, and run a massive ecological deficit,
Right.
are our traditional metrics of human development actually measuring human flourishing?
Yeah.
Or are they just measuring a society's industrial survival?
That is such a good question.
And looking ahead, if the future requires green development, will the highly educated female population finally be given the political power needed to steer the ship away from the environmental cliff?
Will the system adapt, or will it just crash?
It's something you really have to wonder about.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive through the sources today.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We encourage you to look closely at the data in your own lives and communities. See what's actually driving the numbers around you. We'll see you on the next deep dive.